Aha! This is Laborc, and it is so nice to have you here. These are the paints you need. By the way guys, the detailed paint list is in the video description below. Papa Laborc starts with the most inner part, which are the trousers and the undergarments between his armor and tabard. I mixed a little bit of black to the neutral grey and used the base layer consistency. There is not much surface to cover at this step, but on the trousers try to follow the shape on the folds and you can use some stippling to help you blend the color. If you are not familiar with the technique, you basically create small dots with your brush around the area that you like to blend. I attached the highlight reference photos to the Patreon link. It will help you guys a lot as they help me with the highlight placement. If you're not a Patreon of Papa Laborc, you can be one for only €2 a month and have access to these pictures and early access to the tutorials. Now, to blend in our new layer silky smooth like Granny's butt cheek, we glaze over the area. So dilute your paint to a super thin consistency and pull the paint from the lower to the higher value area. Use the same brush motion, and if you are after those fine blends, then you might need more layers and a more diluted consistency. After that, I reduce the planes of light with neutral grey. I want those clothes to read as a dark grey, so we need just a little bit of this grey color. Otherwise, the cloth will become this lighter grey and will act as our mid-tone. Continue with the stippling motion so the blending will be much easier. Then we blend in the new layer with some glazing like in the previous step. Offload your brush every time you use glazes or just a thinner consistency so the paint won't run into the recesses, ruining our shadows. If that happens, don't worry, just fix it with black. I'm using Dark Reaper for the tabard, leaving only the extreme shadows black. As you can see, I don't load my brush to the brim with the paint, but I do load it with water. My usual method is to dip the brush in water, then I suck on it like Granny sucks on cooked chicken leg and then dip it into the paint on my palette. After that I wipe off the excess paint on a paper towel. This little routine helps me maintain a consistency of moistness between the bristles. As the paint offloads from the brush with each brush stroke, the less and less paint stays between the bristles. I usually twist the brush on my hand to squeeze out the moisture from the upper part of the bristles to go down the tip. This way I just dilute my paint without rinsing it out and I can start to blend on the spot because I just have a nice glaze consistency in my brush. Mixing some alaitoc blue to the Dark Reaper. This way the tabard will read more as a bluish color. I'm using thin layers, so this new layer basically blends in on its own since this blue and the previous one is pretty close to each other on the color wheel. I'm not really highlighting the left side of the tabard because as you saw in the intro, I'm going to create an OSL effect. If that is something you are not really comfortable doing, that's perfectly fine, but Papa Laborc highly encourages you to try to do it. Even if you can't do it for the first try, I'm sure for the second time it's gonna go much better. Now let's mix a little bit of ice yellow to our blue and reduce the highlight areas. I'm using stippling again to create texture on the tabard and make the blending game easy and joyful, like you were sitting in a Filmington concert. It warms Papa Laborc's soul like it's birds chirping in the morning. I could listen to him all day. Now let's cover all the leather and gold parts with burnt red, leaving only the extreme shadows black. Base layer consistency and try to leave a little bit of a black line between the sections, like the binding on the tabard, or on the belts and the leather pouches, or just blackline it later, whichever you prefer, but do blackline because it will increase the cleanliness of your work tremendously, and if you won't believe Papa Laborc, I will slap on your tiny hand. Let's glaze over the shadowy parts like we did before and smooth out our gradient. I mix some tallarn sand to the burnt red and reduce the highlight areas on the gold element parts. I'm using thin layers again and I leave some of our reddish brown from the previous layer to show through. This gold will be a bit dull and desaturated, but I think it fits quite well with the game's atmosphere. Let's glaze a little bit to smooth out the transition. This is just personal preference. You can have a much rougher NMM effect if you prefer that with less blending. We push the contrast with pure tallarn sand. Our gold NMM start to feel metallic. A little trick for those rivet-like shapes on the sword and all other rivets as well, don't just put a little dot on them. Try to follow the shape with your dot and put another reflection on the bottom part. This will make them look much cooler and they just pop nicely. Another little trick to highlight the crossguard. As you can see, I try to leave a little bit of separation between the sections on the crossguard and the parts that face down, I leave them darker. This will ensure that I don't lose contrast, and if I change my mind later, I can always go back to it. I use the highlights reference photos here as well, but you do need to be creative with the highlights to make the gold parts look metallic. This takes a little bit of practice, but it's a fun process. Okay, let's glaze over this layer too. You can skip this part on the sword because the surface is just too small to make a noticeable difference. I mean, on the crossguard. Add a bit of ice yellow to the tallarn sand and reduce the highlight areas even more. Thin layers and try to be as precise as you can. We don't want to lose contrast, so be careful when applying this layer. I'm focusing on the center on the cross and doing some edge highlights as well. To have crispy edge highlights, you need a base layer consistency and try to angle your brush so that only the side of the tip touches the edges you like to paint. The gold parts are done for now, so let's get back to the leather. Mix some tallarn sand to the burnt red and use stippling to create this weathered down old leather look. Highlight the parts more that should be worn down more from everyday use, like the edges of the pouches and belts, and on the edge of that sheath thingy on the sword. For the boots, just check the highlight reference photos to see where the light catches most of the folds. Continue the process with tallarn sand, focusing mainly on the edges and use stippling to create texture. You can do some thin lines as well to imitate some scratches on the surface of the leathers. This is really a fun process and will improve your stippling game, just get a brush with a nice tip. It's not really good for the tip, but there is no way around it, so don't use your super expensive sable brushes for this technique. Now it's time for the armor. This mini is like Heroic Plus scale, so if this is your first time painting NMM, this is a very good mini to start with, because the proportion ratios of the armor is quite nice, so there are no details that are hard to see or reach. I sketch out the main planes of light with the same texture I used for the trousers and undergarments while leaving the extreme shadows black. This armor is quite beaten up and I want to paint it relatively dark with a high contrast. A bright NMM wouldn't work in my opinion, because these adventurers in the game are not some fancy pants knights. Their equipment is old and used up, so I chose a quite neutral grey for this base layer. I'm preparing for the next blending step by creating these highlights by stippling and applying the horizontal lines on the wrist guard, so it will be much easier to blend this way. Our highlight placement needs to follow the general shapes of the armor. The wrist guard is a cylinder, so the highlights should be placed vertically, and the shoulders and the helmet are more of a sphere shape, so the highlights need to be round. I'm also blending in this phase as well. This is really not rocket science and quite easy to do with a little bit of practice. Don't be intimidated by NMM, just try it. Try to replicate what I'm doing and believe me, you'll be happy with the end result, and please share it with Papa Laborc on Instagram or Facebook. Now with neutral grey, I greatly reduce the highlight areas. I'm not really making much highlights on the hem next to the paper because that part will be affected by our OSL effect, so it doesn't really need much apart from our previous layer. As you see, Papa Laborc stippling all the way, but be gentle, like you would tickle Granny's feet. For some, miniature painting is not considered as art. I think it is, because we are expressing things with our paint job. For example, these rougher blends will communicate that this Crusader been through some battles, his armor is not as shiny as it was, he is on a journey that might not end well for him, and he is holding a glowing piece of paper that banishes the undead creatures. It's just such a cool concept. If you prefer this really beat up armor, then skip this part, but I'm going to apply a few layers of glaze just to smooth it out a little bit. Same method we used before, and remember to use the same brush motion starting in the darker part and moving to the brighter. If you feel like you created too big highlights, then just reverse that motion and switch back to the previous color. Continue with mixing a bit of pale grey blue to a neutral grey. Thanks to the mix, if you apply this in a thin layer, it's gonna blend in like Granny's medicine with her pumpkin stew. I use the same tricks for the rivets at this stage too. Just put a bigger dot on the upper part and a smaller on the bottom part. Papa Laborcs love the effect because it's super simple. Always check your highlights from time to time and take a break during your painting session. This way you can catch some mistakes and remember if something looks a little bit off, it probably is. So don't be afraid about repainting stuff. I know it's a hassle, but also that's the way to improve. To make things a bit more clean and more defined, we are going to blackline between the armor panels and rivets and also between the broken parts of the armor. If you do this right, your mini should start to smell like Granny's garlic toast because it will be so crispy looking. With black, you can get away with a little bit thinner consistency, so you have more time to paint before the paint dries between the bristles. Now with a thin layer of pale grey blue, we push the contrast a bit while also reducing the highlight areas. We don't need maximum opacity with this layer. Use a thicker consistency for edge highlights of the venting holes of the helm. I didn't edge highlight the sword because it's just not clean and crispy enough. If your mini had a better luck of the draw, then do the edge highlights because it will look good on the sword. But as with everything else, this is just personal preference. You can make swords look good without edge highlights as well. Now we start working on the OSL effect. I'm using a 0.2mm airbrush with 1 PSA on the compressor. The dilution rate for the paint is 1 part paint and 1 part thinner, so it's quite thin. You can do this part without an airbrush using glazes of this color, it's just faster with the airbrush. Apply small bursts and only paint one side of the mini with this color. We don't want this OSL effect to overpower the whole paint job we previously did. Alright, now we glaze skrag brown to the parts we couldn't really reach with the airbrush without spraying this color all over the whole mini. Not only that, but we can increase the opacity of the color to certain parts. This will make a nice and intense foundation to our OSL color. In the video game, the colors vary based on how much light you have in your torch. I'm going for a yellowish orange glow, so it would fit with the game's theme. I mixed a little bit of zamesi desert to increase the values of the OSL, focusing around the edges of the paper and the middle section. Use a thin layer and try to blend it in. Try to avoid paint pooling up in the crevices of the scribbles, but since they are not so crispy, it's pretty hard to do that. On the tabard, you only need a little bit of zamesi desert on the folds that are close to the paper, but you can apply it more bravely on the helm since metal is more reflective than cloth, if it's clean and nicely polished, so be creative with it. After that, I mixed some ice yellow to the zamesi desert and used it on the center of the paper. Yeah, future Papa Laborcs here. On second thought, I didn't really like that and skipped this part the second time I painted the paper. Oh, second time Papa Laborcs, why is that? Well, because I'm going to screw up in the next step, watch. Then I tried to recess shade with Tamiya black panel liner and because of that I ended up repainting the paper. As I said, the writing on the paper is not really defined, so the oil wash can't really flow into the crevices. Not only that, but I thought I wouldn't use a gloss varnish to make the oils flow better, so maybe try it with a layer of gloss varnish applied first. So later I freehanded some of the scribings with black. That was too dark. So don't mind that, a little bit later Papa Laborcs will fix them. For the other side of the miniature, I glazed a thin layer of demonic yellow over the highlights. This acts as another light source coming from the dungeon. It's just a faint yellowish hue, but it will increase the luminosity of the enemy and make it more interesting. With the same method, I glazed some naggaroth night over the shadowy parts of the enemy and the tabard. Black is great for the shadows. Dark gold color makes it look much more interesting and adds some depth to it. Basically, you can use any dark and cold color for the shadows that you prefer, but be consistent with it. For the final highlights of the NMM, I used ivory. Thin consistency again and super tiny dots for the maximum highlights. Wanted to push the highlights a bit further on the tabard, so I mixed some ivory and ice yellow to the alaitoc blue. It's only for the folds at the top part, so we can keep the focal point around the helmet. Alright, so Papa Laborc repainted the whole paper that he's holding and skipped the ice yellow part, and now I'm just creating random lines that could read as handwriting. Couple of dots here and there, some vertical lines like it's a letter T's or P's lower part, and aiming into the center of the crevice for the most part. The paint I'm using is not super thin, but it flows nicely from the brush. With that, the Crusader is done and ready to play with. If you like this tutorial, please leave a comment if you'd like to see Papa Laborc cover more heroes from Darkest Dungeon. So thank you for joining me on this little painting adventure. A huge thanks to my Patreons who support these kind of videos. With special shout out to Jonathan Rhodes, Cold-Blooded Dom, Trying to Paint Minis, Jonathan Mosner, Rulzak, Vlad D, Earthapple21, Paints and Games, and Joseph Ebenheim. If you want to support the work of Papa Laborc, you can do that on Patreon, where you will have early access to these videos and can vote on the next mini. If this tutorial is a little bit above of your skill level and you need a bit of extra help, online coaching is available. I hope the rest of your day will be as smooth as a granny's butt cheek.